Hello everybody, it's my pleasure to present this topic today about the ventilatory management or strategies in COVID-19 patients as a part of COVID-19 advanced course. My name is Amr Abu Laila. I am ICU consultant in the military hospital in Dhahran in Saudi Arabia, as well as professor of critical care in Egypt, Alexandria University. I hope this presentation will be fruitful and useful for all my colleague intensivists. I consider it's a really great challenge because of a lot of conflict and debate about how to manage the patient with this COVID-19 on the ventilator. This is the objectives of my presentation today. I will talk about the pathophysiology of lung affection of COVID-19. Then we will move to the basic ventilatory strategies, starting from the non-invasive ventilation, moving to the basic ventilatory setting of invasive mechanical ventilation. Then we'll go to some of the rescue management. I will talk in details, and I want to highlight some important data regarding using the delta pressure or driving pressure, also the importance of transpulmonary pressure. And I will go very briefly about the airway pressure release ventilation because there is a special lecture presented by my colleague Dr. Wael about the details of airway pressure release ventilation. And I will not talk also about the nitric oxide ECMO because there is a special lecture in this course for these topics. Why it's very challenging, the topic, considering this report from UK, considering high incidence of mortality about the ventilated patient with COVID-19. This sample includes more than 3,800 patients. Unfortunately, more than 1,000 of the patients died and of mechanical ventilation, and this represents 66% of the total patient on the ventilator. And mortality also was almost 19 or 20% of the patient receiving basic respiratory support. Very high percentage really, leading to an opinion considering that putting the ventilator for the COVID-19 patient is bridge to nowhere. It's a lot of frustration about the results. More frustration is there from USA also, from New York. They have incidence of mortality is very high, approaching 80%. The data also coming from Italy is not very different from that. The mortality is almost 70 or 80%. Also, the results from Germany may be a little bit better, considering a mortality of around 50 or 60% of ventilated patients with COVID-19. Still, it's a very high mortality and very serious disease, and all people are struggling to find what is the way and how to improve this. Also, there is a lot of conflict, a lot of paper released the last months about the management, the disease, the pathology, the pathogenesis, and a lot of term ARDS versus pneumonitis, atypical pneumonia, new term CARDS or corona ARDS also discovered in some of this paper. And the last one is the pseudo ARDS, is a new term also emerging. What is the pseudo ARDS? A lot of conflicts, a lot of paper, and still the result is not satisfactory. So to go through the pathophysiology, from me, I consider this the most important slide in my presentation because a good understanding of the pathophysiology of this disease, COVID-19 affection of the lung, is the clue or the key to be able to manage your patient properly, because the pathophysiology is not an easy one and you should understand what is going on. The first point in the pathophysiology, there is a direct invasion of the virus to the lung. As you see here, the virus through this S-spike protein, which is coming to this angiotensin converting enzyme 2 receptor present in the alveoli of the lung. This receptor, this spike protein are cleaving the receptor and they are getting entrance inside the alveoli in this way and start its way of replication. It's affecting mainly the endothelium of the lung, this virus affecting the endothelium, leading to endothelial injury, and this subsequent pathology is running away. The second important point in the mechanism is the VQ mismatch with shunt. What is going on initially that the patients, they have, from this inflammatory reaction from the virus, they will have increase in the perfusion of the lung and vasodilation of the pulmonary vessels. So we will have basically that the alveoli will have a higher perfusion with normal aeration. This is what we can understand from the shunt fraction. It's non-ventilated or regularly ventilated alveoli with good perfusion or over-perfusion. This is what going on initially. Then later on in the disease, maybe after 1 week, the alveolar injury is starting to increase more and more, so we'll have combined effect of shunt with low ventilation with high perfusion, leading to significant VQ mismatch. Another mechanism, which is the dead space resulting from pulmonary embolism, and I will show you some of the data study examining or investigating this point. And there is high incidence really of pulmonary embolism with this COVID-19, and leading also to a dead space mechanism in which there is an aeration of the alveoli, but there is no perfusion, obstruction of the flow of the pulmonary vessels, and this is adding on to the VQ mismatch. And it was found that the incidence of pulmonary embolism actually is higher around day 8 to 10 from the starting or the beginning of the disease, which is a little bit later than the occurrence of the shunt, if it will happen. Another important mechanism, which is the systemic inflammatory response syndrome and the cytokine storm, which is associated with this viral infection, the COVID-19. And again, the storm will be on the maximum power around day 8 to 10, releasing a lot of cytokines, namely interleukin 6 and interleukin 1. This is adding on to, with the endothelial injury in the lung, to more harmful effect on the alveoli and oxygenation. This is more and more systemic effect on the lung. Last and not least, also there is a very important point, which is patient self-inflicted or self-induced lung injury, which is related to high work of breathing. If the patient is in respiratory distress and breathing significantly and doing great work of breathing, he will have what we call self-inflicted lung injury. It's adding on to the pathology and to the hypoxia and to the bad outcome of the patient. So we should stop this process. We should not leave the patient in this high work of breathing and to have more injury. And the last point is also what we know to all of us, the ventilator-induced lung injury. If you are not applying a proper setting from the ventilator, you will be faced also with the ventilator lung injury, associated lung injury, which is adding on to the pathology. So what you can understand from this slide, that the pathology is not a simple one. It's a very complex pathology. It's an interaction between 6 or 7 different factors adding to this lung affection or the pathophysiology of the lung. And what is the share of each of these factors in each patient? It's different. That is why we cannot thinking that the pathology is the same in different patients, because you have different factors. Not all the factors are applied for all patients, and not all the factors are applied on the same time, because the start of the disease after 2-3 days, maybe you have a certain pathophysiology, and with the progression of the disease after 10 days, the situation is different. So by understanding this point, you have to manipulate your ventilatory setting in each stage according to what you have. You should understand very well the pathophysiology. You will be able to explore where is the patient or what is the situation of your patient in this stage, and accordingly you can guide the management. Some of the data related to what we just mentioned about the acute pulmonary embolism. This is a French study on 129 patients, and they explore the incidence of pulmonary embolism. It's average done on day 9 of the start of the disease, and they found that there is 23% of patients having pulmonary embolism, which is a relatively high percentage. And this is usually the ground appearance of this affection of the lung for COVID-19. And here later on some consolidation, also basal consolidation. And you can see here the feeling defects in the CT pulmonary angio revealing an diagnosis of pulmonary embolism. So considering this high percentage of patient, high incidence of pulmonary embolism, it can be considered an important part of the disease pathogenesis. Another topic here, or another study about the blood clotting pattern in the lung of COVID-19 patient. And they describe here a new term, which is like the DIC, we have here PIC, pulmonary intravascular coagulopathy. And they are talking about the same point and the affection of the endothelium and the high incidence of thrombosis and occurrence of micro and macro pulmonary embolization, which is adding on to the suffering of the patient and the pathophysiology of the disease. Another study considering the autopsy of some of the patients died from COVID-19, and it's very clear here that the lung tissues, they are showing micro and macro thrombi, denoting again the occurrence and the importance of considering the pulmonary embolism, talking about the pathology. Another paper also, COVID-19 lung problems. This is actually not a paper, it's a comment on the management of COVID-19 respiratory distress. They are here describing what we just mentioned about the COVID-19 affecting mainly the endothelium of the blood vessels, basically in the initial stage of the disease with near normal alveoli. Then later on, when the progression of the infection and the immune response of the body, what will happen that with this mechanism of alveolar injury, what is supposed to happen in normal persons, that we have a reflex vasoconstriction of the pulmonary vessels to allow the blood to go to more healthy area. But what is going on with this COVID-19, there is a term, it's the vasoplasia. There is a failure of this compensatory mechanism, and there is really normal blood flow or even vasodilatation of the pulmonary vessels, directing more blood flow to the injured or damaged area of the alveoli, adding on more to the shunt, what we call about the shunt and the VQ mismatch, meeting with high perfusion to a low aerated area. This is Professor Gattinoni, of course, well known to all of you, the different pattern of respiratory failure, or the two different phenotype, describing the phenotype L with high compliance initially, and then another phenotype, which is the phenotype H with low compliance, less than 40, and the management should be guided accordingly. And we'll talk about this phenotype in details. This is again the same point about type 1, and you can see here some ground glass opacity, and here it's more dense consolidation. And of course, it's very clear from the CT between these two picture or two different phenotype of the disease. There is less aeration here, less gas volume, and of course lower compliance. Compliance average is 43 in these patients, and compliance here is 80. This is matching with the phenotype L, and this matching with the phenotype H. Actually, this is a very good hypothesis, and all the world are following this one because, of course, Professor Gattinoni is one of the leading persons in the mechanical ventilation all over the world, and also due to high experience of Italian physician with dealing with COVID-19 patient. But what we think, or maybe this Dr. Gattinoni also mentioned, is it really two types or two stages of the disease? I mean, it's some patient will be presented with this phenotype H and other with phenotype L, or most of the patient will start with the high compliance or the phenotype H, and then will progress with time from starting with L and going to the H later on. If you can see some of our radiological findings also matching with the progression of the disease, what we will see here that most of the patients are starting in the first few days of the COVID-19 with only the peripheral ground glass opacities, and with the progression of the disease and the more infiltration of the interlobular spaces and interlobular septum, we will have this crazy paving pathology, and after 1 week or more we will start to have this very dense consolidation of the patient. And this is actually matching with the hypothesis of Dr. Gattinoni that it's clear from this CT initially with this ground glass that you will have better compliance of the patient or higher compliance matching with the phenotype L. And with the progression of the disease, you will move to very bad or low compliance here, and this is the phenotype L. and it's very phenotype H, and it's very important to understand the progression of your disease, because the management definitely will not be the same with higher compliance compared to lower compliance. Of course, the ventilatory management will be totally different. Sometimes some patients are presented to you late, so you are seeing the patient for the first day, but you will find a very dense consolidation and low compliance. So you are starting managing your patient from this stage, which is the phenotype H. And sometimes also some patients will present it with mild picture and they will improve quickly, so they will not proceed to the other limb or other part of the disease, the more bad or the worst outcome. So you can consider that you will see the two phenotypes in different patients, or you can see the two phenotypes in the same patient in different stage. This is one of the criticism of for the hypothesis of Dr. Gattinoni. This is from website just released the 1st of May from one pulmonologist, intensive care doctor from USA. He is criticizing the point of Dr. Gattinoni, and there is another new term, which is the pseudo ARDS. They are considering the patient who improved very quickly after mechanical ventilation within the first 12 or 24 hours with a higher PF than 150. It's not a true ARDS, they are pseudo ARDS, and they have no real pathology of ARDS. They are criticizing Dr. Gattinoni because they are thinking that the patient with the phenotype L, they are applying for them initially low PEEP, which is less than 10, and higher tidal volume, which is not matching with the guidelines of managing ARDS, and this is not the way, and that's why they are not convinced about the theory of two different phenotypes. Moreover, they concluded, or they noticed during the study, that for starting from the day one, that the compliance of all the patient is almost 40 or below. It means that there is no phenotype L, and all the patient have a very poor compliance matching with regular or standard pathology of ARDS you are seeing. And as we mentioned, it might be related to the stage of the disease. You will see the patient, that's why maybe you see the patient in late stage, and this is the situation. And by the way, this is done on a small sample size, only 66 patient and retrospective study. I'm not very convinced about this result, but just I display it to tell you that this theory of phenotypes is very respectable, of course, but it's not final. We are just discovering new data and new things every day, and you should be open-minded to any criticism or any modification to what we are having now. So after understanding the pathophysiology and some of the study related to it, we concluded that we have a different mechanism for the pathophysiology. We have a very complicated pathophysiology. Many factors are contributing in the disease. And according to the clinical picture, the work of breathing, the lab, and the mechanical ventilation setting, the radiology, you can conclude what is the situation of your patient, and accordingly you will tailor your management and your basic ventilatory management according to the situation. And it's very difficult to say at this stage that we have a fixed protocol managing the COVID-19 patient. Actually, my conclusion from the pathophysiology is that the management should be highly tailored and individualized for each patient according to his situation and his circumstances. Starting with the basic ventilatory management, it's an escalation management step, of course, starting with very basic conventional oxygen with regular simple nasal cannula or face mask, just to reach an oxygen saturation of more than 94. Which is a very simple situation, which is not most commonly faced in the ICU. This is maybe in the medical ward or high dependence unit. We are not seeing in the patient in the intensive care, mostly in this simple stage. Then after failure of the first step or progression of the disease, we have to move to high flow nasal cannula or non-invasive ventilation. And there is very important concept here and a very important tricky point. What we are targeting with a non-invasive or high-flow nasal cannula, are we are targeting to improve the oxygenation or to reduce the work of breathing? Actually, targeting the oxygenation is a very short-term plan. If you are putting only the non-invasive and you are keeping your eye on the saturation, considering saturation improved, this is a good achievement. Really, it's not. Your target should be mainly the reduction of work of breathing, because if the patient is still struggling, doing a lot of effort and swinging in the intrathoracic pressure during his breathing, you will induce for him, or you let him to induce what we call the patient self-inflicted lung injury, and you should stop this process, and you should consider this a sign of failure if the work of breathing will not be reduced, and you should proceed directly to the invasive mechanical ventilation to relax and rest your patient and stop the current of injury happening inside the lung. And you should not be misguided by the oxygenation. If you have a good oxygenation but the patient is not improving clinically, you should not wait and delay your decision for intubation. Another point is also the application of this helmet or tent non-invasive ventilation, which is very good considering that the spread of infection is very high using the high-flow nasal cannula and non-invasive. So considering this one is very good, this helmet non-invasive, to reduce or prevent the dissemination of the infection from the patient to the staff, if it's available or applied, because it's not available in most of the hospital. Actually, it's indicated the non-invasive, of course, if the saturation is less than 94, you cannot achieve your target. It's definitely an aerosol producing procedure, so it should be done in a negative pressure room with all precautions for airborne precaution from the staff. An appropriate antimicrobial filter should be located on the expiratory limb of the non-invasive or CPAP to reduce the spread of infection. Another technical point that there is two different pattern or two different ways of applying the non-invasive, one with one limb, both inspiratory and expiratory, and one with two limbs. The first one, with sharing the inspiratory and inspiratory limb, they have here an exhaust or expiratory exhaust. This is very dangerous because it's all the expiratory flow will come from this one with very high incidence of spreading of infection. For this one should not be used, of course, for the COVID-19 patient. For spreading of infection, you should use only closed circuit inspiratory one with application of the filter as we mentioned. Surviving sepsis campaign guidelines, they are recommending the high flow nasal cannula over the non-invasive ventilation, and actually this one is debatable also this point, because especially in UK they are running a lot of studies regarding the use of non-invasive, and they have some good results. But as we mentioned, the point is, if the patient is improving, his work of breathing is reduced, this is the point, regardless it's high flow or nasal cannula or non-invasive BiPAP. Applying surgical mask for patient on high flow nasal cannula is very important, because this is very nice graph showing the spread of infection with regular breathing with simple nasal cannula. And here the spread of infection is very high applying the high flow nasal cannula. The virus will move and travel for long distance. So it's applicable to put your patient on the high flow nasal cannula and to put a mask for your patient also to reduce the infection and the viral load exposure to your staff. Close monitoring, as we mentioned, is very, very important, and consider early intubation if the patient is not improving. Maximum trial of 1 or maximum 2 hours should be there. If there is no real improvement in the work of breathing, you should proceed directly to the intubation to stop the lung injury happening with a patient struggling to get his breath. Another point that in certain situations that the high flow nasal cannula or non-invasive can be considered as the appropriate ceiling of management, like patient who are considering DNR, or you don't like to escalate the management. Sometimes you are leaving them as the maximum support you will provide if you have a decision not to escalate your management to invasive mechanical ventilation. And in certain situations, of course, we have now that a lot of centers, they are suffering too much from the resources. You are obliged to apply the non-invasive if you have no enough ventilator, invasive ventilator. You are obliged to leave the patient on non-invasive for longer time until you have a clear ventilator to the patient. Considering also the awake proning, it's a very nice point that a lot of investigation, also a lot of expert denoting this point, using the awake prone positioning, putting the patient prone while they are still awake. This was found to reduce the work of breathing, which is very important, as you mentioned, and also it's improving the VQ mismatch, maybe by directing the blood flow to the more healthy area. I'm not sure, but what we found that this is mechanism will improve the VQ mismatch and oxygen saturation, and it reduces the work of breathing, and it's really a promising technique, and it's recommended to try it with all patients on high flow nasal cannula. Then the next step in the management after the escalation from the conventional or regular nasal cannula to high flow nasal cannula will go to the invasive ventilation. And of course, we have the intubation protocol, which is a little bit different, or we should consider certain precautions applying the intubation for the COVID-19 patient. It should be done, of course, by the most experienced, skilled person, wearing the full protective equipment with airborne isolation, all these precautions. Using an intubation safety box or fiber box, which is now developed in many hospitals to isolate the patient from the applicator or the physician, just to put your hands from some opening in the box so you are not exposed to the spread of infection from the patient. And also you should be prepared with everything, special tracheal intubation pack, difficult intubation. You should apply rapid sequence intubation. Applying of video guided laryngoscopy also is recommended. No bagging, of course, is recommended to avoid virus dissemination. And before connecting the patient to the ventilator, we should ensure that the cuff is inflated already to avoid also spreading of the infection during expiration from around the tube. So the cuff should be inflated before the connection. Use the calorimetric capnography to ensure the position of the tube, and even applying the capnography is very important even after connecting the patient to the ventilator to monitor the end-tidal CO2, which is very important application. End-tidal CO2 will help you also to suspect maybe early pulmonary embolism, the occurrence of pulmonary embolism. It will help you for hemodynamic management also. If you have a capnogram, it will be like a good surrogate for the cardiac output. So knowing the end-tidal CO2 is very beneficial, and you are really recommended to have a capnogram for all patients of COVID-19 connected to the ventilator. Again, to the basic ventilatory strategy, you should ensure putting antimicrobial filter within the circuit or on the expiratory limb. And actually, the filter will be blocked from time to time. Maximum time from experts all over the world dealing with this patient, they are suffering that the filter is clotting too much. So the maximum time mostly for the changing is the filter is 24 hours, and sometime if you have high resistance and very low tidal volume, you are obliged to change it earlier than that. Applying closed suction, of course, with no routine change of circuit unless it's highly contaminated, because to avoid spread of infection also. And application of the capnography is very crucial, as you mentioned. Now we will move to the next part, which is the setting of the ventilator. We will go initially with a low tidal volume setting, which is around 6 ml or 6 to 8 ml per kg predicted body weight. And the respiratory rate should be titrated to keep an accepted CO2 and pH more than 7.25. Peer titration also is a very important and critical point in this kind of patient, especially in moderate and severe cases, or what we call the H phenotype with very low compliance. So knowing the actual or real PEEP, it's not easy, and there is a lot of tools to do it. One of it, it's very promising, which is the transpulmonary pressure. I will discuss it in details after a few slides. Also, going with conservative fluid strategy is very important, as the fluid strategy to keep the patient dry most of the time. It will help to improve the oxygenation. but not on the expense of the kidneys, because of course you have high incidence of renal failure also with the patient with COVID-19. So I prefer to use, in spite of this conservative fluid strategy, to have a balanced fluid strategy. You should think about the oxygenation and also the perfusion and the hydration of the kidney, and you should take your decision. Echo and point-of-care ultrasound routine follow-up is very crucial and very important, considering the high incidence of pulmonary embolism, to follow up the progression of the disease on the lung. And because of the isolation restriction, also it's not easy to go for CT very frequent. So using the ultrasound for examination of the lung and to know the fluid status of the patient, considering the echo to see the heart, the right side of the heart, and all of this issue is very important point to master the echo and ultrasound as an adjunct therapy during your mechanical ventilation strategy. Titration sedation, of course, it's very important to keep your patient sedated. RAS -3 to -4 is accepted during heavy or severe cases applying high pressure, so the patient should be under this heavy sedation. What are the target of our ventilation? We should keep the saturation more than 94, keep the oxygen tension more than 60, pH more than 7.25, maintain plateau pressure less than 30. All this basic setting, all you know about it, of course. And we should maintain the driving pressure also less than 14. Driving pressure is the difference between the plateau pressure and the PEEP pressure, and is very, very important. And this term of driving pressure was not very commonly used in the last years, but it's emerging in the last 4 or 5 years. There are a lot of study about the importance of driving pressure. I like to highlight some points regarding this driving pressure in the next slide. And if the driving pressure is high, more than 14, or I mean the difference between the plateau and PEEP, it's better to reduce the tidal volume a little bit. This will reduce the plateau pressure to keep the safe range or the safe difference between the PEEP and plateau in the safe range of 14. Talking about the driving pressure concept, I choose this study. There is actually a lot of study, but this is very illustrative one and very conclusive. This is the driving pressure and survival in ARDS, published in 2015. The study was done initially a retrospective way, describing 9 different reported randomized trials over more than 3,500 patients with ARDS. And they are investigating, the aim of this study to investigate the importance of the driving pressure as independent variable associated with survival. What you can see here in this graph, this is mortality, the incidence of mortality of the patient, and here they are divided the patient in the study in 3 different groups. In this group, as you see, this is the pressures of the patient. The PEEP pressure is here on the black, and this is the plateau pressure. Those patients in sample 1 or group A, they have matching PEEP level, the same PEEP level, but they have higher plateau pressure starting from here to here. And you can see that the mortality is increasing by increasing the plateau pressure, which is quite logical. We know that the mortality with lower plateau pressure is supposed to be less, and this is what we learned from the ARDS over the last few years. Considering group C here, you can see here this group of patients, they have matched plateau around 28, maybe less than 30, but with rising PEEP from different groups of patients. And you can see applying higher PEEP on severe ARDS, the mortality is less, and whenever the PEEP is getting down, the mortality is increasing. But it's very interesting, if you will go to group B to see what is going on, you will see that the PEEP change in the PEEP level here, it's matching between group B and C. However, the mortality here was not changing. And again, the plateau pressure in group B is matching with the plateau pressure in group A, but there is no change in mortality as described in group A. So what we found here, that actually the mortality was not changing here because the driving pressure, or the difference between the PEEP and the plateau pressure, is almost fixed here all the time. It's the same, as you see, it's the same driving pressure, the same difference. And the mortality here, it's related actually not to reduction of PEEP, but to the increase in the driving pressure. Whenever the difference in this gray column will be, this is the gray column representing the driving pressure. With increasing the driving pressure from the PEEP to plateau, the mortality will be high. Going with very low driving pressure, the mortality will be less, and the same here. The driving pressure here is high, with higher mortality, and driving pressure low, with lower mortality. So it's very obvious that the driving pressure itself, it's an independent predictor of mortality for patients with ARDS, and they found from here that they reach this level 15 or 14 as a cutoff value. Above this value, the mortality will increase significantly, and that's why we should all target in our management this driving pressure of 14 not to be exceeded. This is the same the result of the study. So back to our slide, we should maintain all this target. As we mentioned, saturation more than 94, pH more than 7.25, plateau less than 30, and don't forget the driving pressure less than 14. And if you are not able to achieve, you can sacrifice a little bit the tidal volume and minute ventilation, going with lower tidal volume to achieve your target of driving less than 10. Now we will go to the rescue management or rescue therapy for severe cases. We have, of course, proven or evidence-based using the prone position. All the center are applying the prone. And as we mentioned, we are applying the prone very early with COVID-19, even during the non-invasive or high flow nasal cannula, you should start your proning trials. And I will not talk too much about it. It's 16 to 18 hours per day, of course, to be repeated at least for 3 days. This is a protocol in most of the hospital based on the PROSEVA trial. And also application of the muscle relaxant for 48 hours. It's a very good option. Of course, most of the center are applying this. Steroids, the use of steroids, there is some conflict as usual regarding the use of steroids. It's not clear if there is any benefit of using steroid with COVID-19 per se, but if you are dealing with severe ARDS, you can try your steroid protocol according to your local hospital protocol. We are applying the Midori protocol in our hospital, applying misoprednisolone 1 milligram per kilogram body weight intravenous infusion over 24 hours for patients with severe ARDS. Using recruitment maneuver is one of the options, and the most important I want to discuss it with using the transpulmonary pressure for using for patients with requiring high PEEP to be able to adjust the PEEP. Also, a very promising technique, which is airway pressure release ventilation. It's a mode of ventilation described during the ARDS era, and I will show you very few slides for it. It will be described in details in another lecture. Other options like the nitric oxide or inhaled prostaglandins, prostaglandins I2, the Flolan, using the ECMO also can be considered in very severe cases, not responding to all other measures, and it should be highly selective, of course, during mass disaster like we have in COVID-19 with a lot of patients. It's not easy in each hospital to have a lot of ECMO resources to put the patient on ECMO in easy way. This is a brief description of the airway pressure release ventilation mode. It's a very nice mode. It's depending on the application of 2 levels of pressure, one high pressure, one low pressure. And also you have a T-high application of the high pressure for a long time, leaving also short time of release, which is the T-low for release or expiratory phase. And the beauty of this mode, and the patient can breathe spontaneously all over the mode. So you cannot apply, by the way, muscle relaxant while applying airway pressure release ventilation. It depends on the interaction or the spontaneous breathing of the patient, with some pressure support, of course. And this is the way you are applying longer inspiratory or high pressure time with very short expiratory time. And this was found to reduce the work of breathing and to improve the oxygenation. I will not go how to start and how to adjust the setting and how to go with the weaning from this mode. It will be described in a separate lecture because it needs some details. This is one of the important studies applied on the airway pressure release ventilation in China, over 138 patients in 2017. There is 71 patient subjected to this mode of airway pressure release ventilation versus a standard or low tidal volume group patient. And what we found that this is the airway pressure on the orange color. They have lower plateau pressure, higher lung compliance, higher oxygenation, higher mean airway pressure. It means the outcome was much better applying this mode in severe ARDS with improvement in all parameters of oxygenation and respiratory mechanics also. So we should consider this one as one of the options during severe cases of ARDS not responding well. Now I have to discuss over the next few minutes in briefly what is the concept of transpulmonary pressure. If you are not aware about it, it's very important to understand the concept. What we are applying in the transpulmonary pressure, we are putting a small catheter, maybe it's nasogastric tube or modified nasogastric tube with a manometer. The manometer will be in the esophagus, measuring the pressure inside the esophagus, and this will reflect the esophageal pressure, will reflect the pressure inside the pleural space. And we have to measure the transpulmonary pressure, which is the difference between the pressure inside the alveoli or the alveolar pressure or the plateau pressure and the esophageal or the pleural pressure. What is the importance of this measurement? This will help you to understand the compliance or the mechanics of the lung separately from the chest wall. What we are actually measuring in our measure, that we are measuring the compliance of the respiratory system overall, including the lung and chest wall. And sometimes it's not easy to understand from this number or the plateau pressure of 30 how is the lung compliance and how is the chest wall compliance. This is a very nice example to explain to you. If you have an alveolar or plateau pressure of 39 and you have a pleural pressure of only 5 centimeter water, you will have a distending pressure of 34. Here, with the same number you are measuring from the ventilator, which is 39, you will have a pleural pressure of 30. The pleural pressure is very high. So the distending pressure or the movement of the alveoli will move only between this 9 centimeter water, between 39 and 30. So the movement of the alveoli will be very limited, and it's safe here to apply more pressure, while it's not safe here to apply any pressure, because you're really distending the alveoli. You will have barotrauma and you'll have a lot of complications. And this is very nice also to apply it to decide what is the end expiratory pressure, to apply the PEEP to have an end expiratory positive pressure. The point is, at the end of expiration, if the pleural pressure is higher than the pressure inside the alveoli will collapse and you will have recurrent atelectasis and hypoxia. So our target, while adjusting the PEEP during the end of expiration, to be sure that the alveolar pressure or the PEEP pressure inside the alveoli is higher than the pressure outside the alveoli. I will show you this in the next slide. So with all our respect to the plateau pressure and all the guidelines, we are managing our patient respecting the number of 30. 30 sometimes is not reflecting the real situation of the lung, because we might have a very good lung and very poor chest wall compliance, and plateau pressure will limit you from increasing the pressure, increasing the tidal volume, which is not the situation, and one size does not fit all in this critical condition, of course. This is one of the studies. There is a lot of studies describing the use of esophageal pressure. The background for this study was done to optimize the level of PEEP, as we mentioned, because it's difficult to determine. And they choose two patients or two groups of patients. One will apply the esophageal pressure management, and one will be managing according to the ARDS network, which is the standard practice. The primary endpoint for this study was the improvement on the oxygenation, and also they are monitoring the improvement in respiratory compliance and the patient outcome. This is a baseline data from all the patients. It was almost the same. All the data was the same in both groups, the esophageal group or the manometric group and the conventional group. And after applying this technology, you can see there is significant change in the respiratory compliance here, on the oxygenation. The PF ratio here was 280 versus 191. So applying higher PEEP pressure with the help of this esophageal pressure guided technology will help us to improve the oxygenation. Also, you can see here that they are applying higher pressure, higher level of PEEP, PEEP 17 versus only PEEP of 10 in the conventional treatment group. And the tidal volume, of course, is higher also here, 470 versus 418. And also the plateau pressure here is 28 versus 25. But it's a safe plateau pressure, as we mentioned, because we are considering the lung compliance here, measuring the plateau pressure, not the compliance of the whole respiratory system. And the most important point here, as you can see, this is the transpulmonary end expiratory pressure. It is the PEEP measured at the end of expiration by the help of this catheter. You can see here in the conventional treatment, at the end of expiration, the pressure was negative inside the alveoli, -2, which is not good, as I mentioned. It will lead to atelectasis and will reduce the compliance and oxygenation. But here, with the adjustment of the PEEP level, increasing the PEEP level, we are able to achieve at the end of the expiration a positive pressure of 0.1, and this is very helpful to improve the oxygenation. This is an important graph to highlight this point. You can see here at the start of the study, all the pressure, this is the pressure PEEP at the end of expiration and at the beginning of the study. And this is using the group of esophageal pressure monitoring. And we are able to have the PEEP pressure above the 0 level here all over the study in day 1, 2, and 3. While in the conventional treatment, all the time, the pressure at the end of expiration is negative. And this is leading to more collapse, as we mentioned, and loss of oxygenation. So application of the transpulmonary pressure application for adjustment of PEEP is very crucial. And I applied myself for many patients of ARDS, and we are able to manage the patient with very high level of PEEP reaching 20 and 24 with the guidance of this technology, just to have a good positive expiration and expiratory pressure in the alveoli at the end of expiration and to avoid the collapse of the alveoli. I have to skip this another study describing the same concept of transpulmonary pressure. I will bypass it. But just a quick look here that after putting the two group, we are able here to manage the plateau pressure in this group after applying the esophageal pressure was 38. This is the total plateau pressure what we are measuring on our routine ventilator, reflecting, as we mentioned, the lung and chest wall. But the actual plateau pressure, which is plateau pressure at end of, applying the esophageal pressure manometer is only 25. It's still safe. But you cannot accept 38 blindly, because if I will tell you 38, you will tell me you are bypassing our guidelines. The plateau pressure mons are 30, but actually it's 38, but it's still safe because the actual lung compliance is good and the plateau pressure inside the alveoli is only 25. This is back to the slide of the rescue therapy. We discussed it all now, the airway pressure release ventilation and TPP and all other parameters. Then we'll move to the last point of our presentation about the weaning. We'll follow your regular weaning protocol in your hospital, but just quick points or tricks that don't consider weaning before improvement of the inflammatory parameters and the cytokine storm, because there is very high incidence of weaning failure and re-intubation. And if you are not sure that the patient, the pathology or the pathogenesis of the disease starts to settle down, postpone the weaning until the patient is more stable. During extubation, you should follow the same precaution of intubation, because it's again an aerosol producing procedure, and applying all the precaution with airborne isolation and all the PPP equipment is very important. After extubation, you can consider support with high flow nasal cannula or non-invasive ventilation again. And if you did not reach a successful weaning till day 10 of intubation, you should consider tracheostomy at this stage. It means that the patient will stay for longer time. Unless you think the patient is very sick, he can die in the next few days, you should consider the tracheostomy to facilitate your job. This is maybe our final slides. This is I was not planning to put it, but I found there is a lot of debate also in the medical group. This is a German study They are suggesting an alternative ventilatory strategy, applying a very low PEEP of 0 and very high tidal volume of 800 with PCO2 less than 35, which is totally against what we learn about the regular ARDS. But actually, they apply this protocol on only 8 patients of COVID-19 patients, and the result that within 24 hours they were able to extubate 2 patients on mechanical ventilation, and the other 6 patients are still alive on mechanical ventilation. They are better, they have better oxygenation, but they are still not weaned, but they didn't die. This is another point of view. I cannot comment on it, but the conclusion of the authors here, they are saying that they believe that the COVID is not an ARDS, and it does need a different strategy of ventilation. Applying blindly the ARDS protocol for this patient is not helpful, according to what they believe. But for me, the evidence is very weak, relying on only 8 patients, and but just I display it as a different point of view. As you mentioned, should be open-minded and to accept all the idea, but I don't believe too much applying this strange setting PEEP of 0 and high tidal volume for this kind of patient will be good, unless, as we mentioned, we should describe what is the pathogenesis of the patient, what is the stage of the patient we have radiologically, and measuring lung compliance, and decide. A quick review of this is the official guidelines of ARDS, just to remind you about their guidelines, that we should apply low tidal volume, 6 ml per kg, plateau pressure less than 30, high PEEP and PEEP titration, of course, driving pressure less than 14, using the proning and neuromuscular blocker for severe cases. And there is also a gray zone about using the ECMO, using the steroids and the recruitment, and they are against the use of high frequency ventilation and use of nitric oxide. This is the usual or regular guidelines of ARDS released almost 2 or 3 years ago. But now there is some data regarding the use of nitric oxide. Maybe it will have a role on the COVID-19, considering different pathogenesis of the patient. It's not a classical ARDS cases, as I mentioned. So we should move maybe the nitric oxide from here to at least one of the options to be tried. Surviving sepsis campaigns, they are not away from the ARDS guidelines. They are almost stuck to the ARDS guideline. They are applying high PEEP, neuromuscular blocking agent, considering also the proning, traditional recruitment proning here, and it's almost the same as the regular ARDS guidelines. There is no significant input from this surviving sepsis campaign. This is our personal protocol in the military hospital, in my hospital in Dhahran. We are applying this respiratory management protocol for COVID-19, starting with simple oxygen, advanced to high flow nasal cannula and non-invasive for short time with considering awake proning. And then we are applying the invasive mechanical ventilation strategy with tidal volume 6 to ml per kg, with titration of PEEP, targeting also plateau pressure less than 30, driving pressure less than 14, proning, steroid, muscle relaxant as needed. And then according to the compliance, if we have a high compliance more than 40, considering the pathology of phenotype L or the pneumonitis picture, we are considering with the proning lower PEEP level, considering also using nitric oxide and prostaglandins. And if the compliance is very low or typical ARDS picture, we are considering higher PEEP, of course. We are considering the recruitment, using the transpulmonary pressure to adjust PEEP, and considering also the mode of airway pressure release ventilation. In both limb, if the situation is not improving and the hypoxia is refractory for more than 6 hours, we are considering the ECMO service. We have ECMO service in our hospital, and we decided to be for only selected patient. If patient are considering a good prognosis with less comorbidities, and we are considering the patient will improve, we will consider ECMO for them. And there is some protocol and criteria, and I think there is also a special lecture for ECMO. Maybe this will be discussed. And of course, don't forget the intubation protocol and all the precautions we mentioned during intubation also. This is just a guide, and everyone can tailored his protocol according to the resources and the situation in his hospital. So my home message to you that trying only a short trial of high frequency nasal cannula non-invasive ventilation for maximum 1 or 2 hours, and if no improvement, work of breathing is not improving, consider early invasive ventilation, and don't rely, as I mentioned, too much on the improvement of oxygenation without improvement in the work of breathing. Very good interpretation of the pathophysiological background on individual base for each patient, because the pathophysiology is very important. You should go through the history, the clinical conditions, the work of breathing, the radiological data, the compliance, all the parameters together. You will be able to understand what is the situation of your patient, and you should discover this point or follow up this point daily, because the management can be changed from day to day according to the progression of the pathophysiology, as we mentioned. Decision for anticoagulation is very crucial. If you have a document or high suspicion of pulmonary embolism, you should also think about the anticoagulation plan. Early proning, it's very important even with high flow nasal cannula before intubation. Standard ARDS protocol going with low tidal volume 6 ml per kg, plateau pressure less than 30, driving pressure less than 14. PEEP titration is very crucial, as I mentioned. Applying transpulmonary pressure whenever feasible, it's a very good option. It will help you to improve or titrate your PEEP easily. Another option also as a rescue management, like the airway pressure release ventilation, is very promising, but start it early. Use of nitric oxide and other rescue therapy like prostaglandins. ECMO is the last resort in especially selected cases. My final word that the COVID-19 respiratory failure is a special form of ARDS, as we mentioned, because of different pathogenesis and different mechanisms. So management should be tailored for each patient. It's difficult, very difficult and tough to have a fixed protocol for all patients, but individualization of the management is mandatory, and day-by-day revision of your plan and the ventilatory plan according to the situation of the patient will help you too much. And our target at the end to reach better mortality from this 60 and 80% to have a better outcome and higher rate of survival for our patient ventilated with COVID-19. Finally, this is the best evidence to my knowledge till the 6th of May, but you know the information is evolving very quickly. So maybe after 2-3 days or maybe after a few hours, we will have a new data, and this will change. So this is till now, this is the best evidence, I think, and I hope it was helpful for all of my colleagues to improve our practice during the ventilatory management of COVID-19. And this is some of the references I used. Thank you very much for your attention.